I'm Mike Uyak, photographer, adventurer, bon vivant. I love exploring the world and discovering just how much I don't know about it. These are some of my stories. I've wanted to go to Montana for a long time, but the real driver for this trip came in the summer of 2016. I was driving around eastern Washington looking for ghost towns and abandoned homesteads, and 2016 was a particularly bad year for wildfires in Washington state, much like Montana is this year. And it occurred to me at that time that the fires, particularly in the Okanagan region of the northeast corner of the state, were burning in the very areas where I wanted to be. And what struck me was a sort of ironically transient nature of these old structures. On the one hand, they've stood for 100, in some cases 150 years, withstood blazing sun, bitter cold, rain, snow, wind, insects and animals, and you sort of assume they'll be there forever. And yet, in an instant, they could be gone forever because of these fires. You never really know just how transient these things are. So even before knowing that 2017 would be a particularly severe fire season in Montana, I knew I had to try and get out there as soon as I could to capture some of these ghost towns before the passage of time erased them forever. Even during my search and preparation for this trip, I would find mention of some ghost town with lots of historic buildings and look on a satellite map to discover that the buildings were simply gone, either from eventual collapse and rot, or because someone had actually bulldozed them and put up new homes in their place. Won't say that progress and renewal is good or bad, but it's a sad note when a piece of history is lost to the mists of time with few people to even note its passing. So my visit might be the only obituary these places might get before they disappear for good. I'm sitting Shiva for our collective past. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Big Sky Country. What's that? Why do they call it Big Sky Country? Why do you think? I'm just giving everyone the opportunity to say that I was outstanding in my field. Montana is a far larger state than it appears on the map, so this is the view you should get used to when you visit. Although it features both the tall peaks of the Rocky Mountains as well as the broad expanses of the northern Great Plains, Montana is far from empty. Known for cattle ranches and vast farmlands hewn from the rocky soil, as well as for gold mines and other mineral riches, it is also home to people who have kept some of the stalwart, industrious spirit of the Old West alive into the 21st century. Yet, as I've discovered elsewhere, some of that history is slowly fading in the memories of its descendants, and reminders of that history are becoming fewer and further in between. Thus, my hunt for these ghost towns and abandoned settlements took me pretty far afield. We're looking at the abandoned mining town of Comet, Montana. This place is fantastic. Let's take a look. From here you can get a pretty good view of the town, or what's left of it anyway. That there, I believe, is the guest house slash brothel. We'll take a look at that a little later. This looks like this is the old bunkhouse for the miners. Let's take a look inside here. A tip for all you urban explorers, and in this case more rural explorers: whenever you're going into abandon a building, just bear in mind they haven't done any maintenance. So the flooring may be unstable, the structure itself may be unsound, and so you need to be very, 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 very careful and think long and hard before actually going inside. Now, I've actually scoped this out, so I kind of already have an idea of what I can put my foot on and what I can't. Looks like the old cooktop for the bunkhouse.
and some of the old bunks. Cozy. I know it looks like this just dropped in here, but pretty sure they just built around it. Speaking of footing, you should always be aware of your own limitations. If you're not particularly sure of foot, maybe exploring is not for you. Let's take a look inside of the mining operation itself. Not exactly in condition like they just left it yesterday, but surprisingly well preserved, considering how long it's been here. And there's still coal sitting here. And made it up here to the top level. So this structure is basically a sluiceway. This is where they brought the ore. Somewhere further up the hill, there's the actual mine. I would bring it here, most likely on rail carts, dump it into these sluices, and it would take it further down the hill to the roadway. And in the process, they would do some of the processing of the ore, so it was more easily transported. Whew. I obviously need to do more cardio. Whew. Some of the old machinery. Yeah, that'll buff out. We can get that running again, right? I think. Come over to the edge very carefully here. So, I think that shaft right there, that is the motive force for all of this. There's a boiler down below where all that coal went into. Fired a steam-powered turbine to turn all the machinery up here further up the hill. Even just walking up the roadway here, it's interesting seeing the mine tailings, all of the chunks of rock that have come out of the ground that have even been thrown away. They weren't worth anything as far as the miners were concerned, but this place would be a geologist's dream. There's, the basalt and black pumice. It's really light, so it's pumice. Lots of quartz, as well as the mineral riches of this area. Prospectors originally came to Montana looking for gold and discovered sapphires later on, then copper, and a lot of others, which is reflected in a lot of the town names around here. There's Galena, Granite, Copper City. You'll see a lot of those, but just seeing the colors of these rocks, if you're a rock hound, this area of the world is pretty special. And just within 10 square feet here, pick up some nice pieces of quartz, some sort of green malachite, some sort of crystal. I need to get that, look at that under a microscope to see what that is, but there's the pumice I picked up, and if you look very, very carefully, there are some sparkly bits in this quartz. Is it gold? Is it iron pyrite? Obviously you want to believe it's gold, but who knows? So I promised you a brothel, so here's your brothel. Now mind you, back in the day, oftentimes guest houses / inns and brothels were occasionally one and the same, especially in really small towns where everything had to serve multiple purposes. I'm not 100% sure about the history of this one, so I don't know if this was strictly a brothel, strictly a guest house, or a combination thereof. Ooh. So, ouch. So this is a little grim. Over time in my travels, I picked up a bit of common sense, I'd like to think. Some of it learning from the mistakes of others, and others through trial and error, mostly error, as I'm sure you know. And part of it is just being a guy and doing stupid things. So, I'd like to pass on some of these nuggets of knowledge to you, for you intrepid travelers out there, in a segment I'd like to call
Use Your Noggin!
So if you're about to enter an abandoned building, and the floor looks like that, and the stairs, well, are gone, but if they look anything like that, don't go in. Don't go any further. It's just a bad idea.
The fate of any mining town is highly dependent on the vein of ore they happen to be digging at that time, and the town of Comet is no exception. The mine itself closed several times in the first half of the 20th century as the vein of ore they were digging petered out, and then reopened again subsequently when new technologies allowed them to tap a little deeper or process the ore a little more efficiently and more cost effectively. But ultimately, the vein of ore ran out, and the mine closed for good in the early 40s. With the demise of the mine, the town would soon follow. One by one, the residents would either move away or die, and today only one of the descendants of the original miners remains in this once prosperous town. I next visited the much better preserved town of Bannack, Montana. A small mining town founded in 1863 to mine the gold ore that runs through these hills, Bannack eventually grew in prosperity and became the capital of the territory of Montana, before statehood in 1883 transferred the capital to the city of Helena. For a time, Bannack thrived, and hosted a colorful menagerie of characters, from shopkeepers and gold assayers, to miners, barflies, and prostitutes, to bootleggers and outlaws. A Methodist church catered to the religious needs of the townfolk, and a large hotel hosted both miners and weary travelers alike. But, like Comet, Bannack's fortunes were tied to the productivity of the mine, and the town had several boom and bust periods before World War II, when all non-essential mining was prohibited. The town had been in decline even before the war, and although mining did resume after the war was over, the price of gold was low, and it quickly became clear it simply wasn't profitable to continue mining operations any longer. With no work to be had, the population began to move on, and soon the town began to fade. In the 1940s, concerned citizens began to make plans to preserve the town for posterity, and over the next 30 years, the state of Montana was able to acquire the town site through private donations and the work of Western Montana State College and the Beaverhead County Museum Association, and begin preservation work on the buildings, though it intended to remain a ghost town rather than a tourist attraction.
It is now run as one of Montana's state parks, and is just one of several examples of ghost towns that have been kept alive through the concerted efforts of people who want to keep this piece of history for future generations. In my search for these abandoned homes and ghost towns, I found a mixture of places that were preserved for their historical significance, towns with a few inhabitants still remaining and either maintaining the original buildings or at least not allowing trespassers to disturb them, and still others that had been left to weather the effects of time and the ever-changing seasons. Some towns, in an effort at renewal, had bulldozed the original buildings and started fresh, while others incorporated whatever they could of the original homes and cabins into the new construction. Since many of these homes belonged to farmers, a good number of them were located miles from any town, and I stumbled across them entirely by accident while wandering any number of unnamed or unmarked dirt roads that crisscross the Montana countryside like the veins and arteries of some great dusty beast. Whenever I found an abandoned home that was left with the family's belongings still inside, it left me to wonder what had become of them, that they would leave everything behind. It was like I got to see a cross-sectional view of someone's life, frozen in time and preserved for posterity under a thick veil of dust and cobwebs. Towns with names like Coloma and Hilger, Elkhorn, Rimini, and Gilt Edge, some barely even showing up at all on the map, all had stories to tell. Many were mining towns, hidden away in the hills and mountains where gold and silver were hewn from the rough earth, while others were farming communities or rail towns, and as fortunes changed with the times, these communities lost their purpose and are quickly being reclaimed by history and the land. Seeing the works of man returning to nature was exactly why my next destination was a little wilder than the ghost towns I had seen the first 3 days of my visit. Before heading into Glacier National Park, I had a couple of stops I wanted to make, first of which was Grey Cliff Prairie Dog State Park. I had every intention of using this backdrop to record several clips for this video, as well as an instructional video I had been meaning to do for some time on lenses, seeing as I had a good selection of them with me, and this was the first time the conditions were perfect to use my new, mostly useless telephoto zoom lens. More on that in another video. However, because Grey Cliff Prairie Dog Town is basically just a turnoff on the side of Interstate 90, pretty much every shot I tried to get was photobombed by people driving through to get a quick glimpse and a snapshot of the prairie dogs. And I finally gave up on recording much dialogue and spent my time shooting my subjects. Cousins of the common ground squirrel, prairie dogs have a long and somewhat contentious history in the Plains states, their burrows often serving as pit traps for unsuspecting cattle, who more often than not must be put down on the spot when they break their legs from stepping in a prairie dog hole. This community is protected, however, as they are often shot on sight by ranchers outside this park, seeking to protect the herd from what they see as a pest. Yet prairie dogs are an important part of the plains ecosystem, creating habitat and serving as prey for a wide variety of predators.
Oh, give me a home where the buffalo roam. Oh, there's one right now.
The other place I needed to visit before I made my way up to Glacier was the National Bison Range. Founded in 1908 by President Theodore Roosevelt, the range is a complex of wildlife reserves intended to maintain a representative herd of bison to preserve the species from extinction. By the late 1800s, American pioneers, ranchers, railway workers, and the occasional passing Yahoo had reduced the population of wild bison from an estimated 30 million to just 100 living individuals. Today, a herd of 300 to 500 bison roam the National Bison Range, which has been instrumental in recovering the species to a current U.S. population of over 500,000. The range, managed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, recommends you don't approach the bison, and instead offers an educational and scenic driving tour through a large portion of the range.
We always describe the great open spaces of places like Montana and Wyoming, the American West, as rugged, but I don't know necessarily that word captures the true grandeur of this region. I can only imagine what it must have been like for the Lewis and Clark Party and the early settlers to come into this area, lay eyes on this landscape for the first time, and see the plains that stretch off seemingly forever, and these rocky crags, and some of the tallest mountains that some of those people have ever seen, stretching toward the sky, and grassy hills covered with mountain goats and pronghorn antelope and bison, millions and millions of bison at the time. Must have been absolutely awe-inspiring. And yes, of course, obviously, once they got to Yellowstone, that blew their minds. But even this, it's just amazing. Now, lest I give you the impression that Montana is nothing but vast, empty spaces full of farms, ranches, abandoned homes, and uninhabited wilderness, bear in mind, Montana is so much more. There's a lot to do. It's just that a lot of what there is to do is outdoors. There's hiking and camping and fishing and motorboating and kayaking and water skiing, horseback riding, spelunking, zip lines, ATV rentals. You can actually go for a camel ride. There's a camel farm here. Why? Why not? There's lots of exploring to do. You can pan for gold. You can dig for your own sapphires if you feel like it. You can go to the House of Mystery. Seriously, look it up sometime. Off of I-90, there's even a wild grizzly bear rescue and education center. Now, what they're teaching the bears there, I have no idea, but I say good for them. In this economy, any new job skills you can get can only help your resume. It occurred to me that with climate change happening to our planet, there might be other things in danger of disappearing forever. Glacier National Park in the northern portion of the state of Montana is, as the name implies, chock full of glaciers. Or I should say, it was. Of the 150 major named glaciers in the park, only 26 remain, and only at a fraction of their original size. By some estimates, at their current rate of melt, those 26 remaining glaciers will be gone by 2030. And if you study your thermodynamics at all, you know that as your surface to mass ratio goes up, the faster a chunk of ice will melt. So some say that the 2030 date is optimistic. Unfortunately, what that meant for me was that if I wanted to see any of these glaciers before they were gone for good, I would have to go sooner rather than later. And I would have to do some hiking. Most of those remaining glaciers are at higher elevations and require a pretty significant trek to see any of them. And well, the show is called Tell Mike to Take a Hike, and I wanted that to be kind of metaphorical, but at some point it stands to reason I would actually have to do at least a little hiking. The glacier that I chose was Grinnell Glacier, up above the Mini Glacier Ranger Station in the more remote northeast corner of the park. One thing I didn't take into account was the fact that the maps I used listed the elevations of the glaciers, but they did not list the elevation of the trailhead, and therefore how much elevation gain I was expecting, or should have. You may have noticed I'm not exactly in marathon shape, so a hike that was nearly straight up was a bit more than I was really prepared for. I didn't need to shout or make much extra noise to frighten away bears like they advise you to do in the guidebooks and all the signs that they post at the trailheads, because my breathing was loud and ragged enough that any bears in the area probably looked at each other and said, "I say, old chap, what the deuce is an elephant seal doing all the way up here? We'd better move on because there's something rather dicey afoot." This is how I imagine bears talk.
I'm going to be honest with you here. I didn't get a lot of footage of my hike up to the Grinnell Glacier, because after the first few miles, it became less and less about getting good shots or even decent B-roll footage, and more about just surviving the day. By the time I actually reached the end of the trail, only half of me cared about even seeing the glacier, and really just wanted food and a comfortably cool place to lie down for a couple of days. Oh yeah, and after several miles of basically uneven stone stairs right up the side of the mountain, I found at the end of the trail, which thankfully featured some pit toilets, there was still another half mile of even steeper, unimproved trail before you could actually see the glacier itself. Don't get me wrong, it was gorgeous up there, and I'm glad I did it. But I guess that's just my excuse for not having much more to show you. You can see here that the glacier once covered much more of this slope, where those diagonal lines cut through the rock down to the meltwater lake. And I'll admit that part of me stopped and stared when this glacier finally came into view over the crest of that final hill, and thought, that's it? I've seen glaciers in Alaska and Antarctica that were massive, and this was tiny by comparison, so it took me a moment to really see what I was looking at and realize how much this must have shrunk over the past 60 years or so. By the way, that water felt really good on my aching feet for about 2 seconds, and then my heat-exhausted little brain registered the fact that it was probably 32.0001 degrees Fahrenheit, and I had to yank them back out and put those socks back on. The glaciers are melting, folks, and it's definitely time to see them before they're gone. There may be nothing we can do to stop it at this point. This made me think about two things. The first is that we, as a species, have always worked hardest to protect and preserve the things we value the most. So it becomes important to reevaluate our priorities from time to time, to make sure we're working to hold on to the right things. In the early 1900s, we decided America needed to have bison in it, and so we pulled the American buffalo back from the brink of extinction. The same goes for other iconic species, including our own national symbol, the American bald eagle. Some people decided that some of the pioneer towns and communities of the Old West were worth keeping to help teach us about our collective past. So we banded together and raised monetary and human capital toward the effort. Yet there are others that were simply abandoned and left for time and the elements to return them to the land. We're now in an age when technology and society has grown and evolved beyond merely local concerns to those more global. And so we must also consider what aspects of our world are most valuable to us, and work on preserving those things as well. Can we save our environment? Can we ensure there is clean air and water for our children, and natural resources to fuel and build our future, and wild spaces to continue to humble, awe, and inspire us and feed our collective soul? The other thing I realized is that even with all the work we do to preserve pieces of our history, the world sometimes conspires to take those things away from us. The fires that spread across Montana in the weeks and months during and following the production of this film have claimed homes, parts of Glacier National Park, including Sperry Chalet right in the middle of the park, and some of the very locations I had visited just a few weeks before. So while we commit ourselves to the task of conservation, of historical treasures and the environment, we must also take time to appreciate those things we fight to save before chance and entropy make that impossible. There is a time for hard work, and a time to rest and contemplate what you have before it's gone for good.
Oh, give me a home where the buffalo roam, and the deer and the antelope play, where seldom is heard a discouraging word, and the skies are not cloudy all day. Home, home on the range, where the deer and the antelope play, where seldom is heard a discouraging word, and the skies are not cloudy all day, where the air is so pure and the zephyrs so free, the breezes so balmy and light, that I would not exchange my home on the range for all of the cities so bright. Home, home on the range, where the deer and the antelope play, where seldom is heard a discouraging word, and the skies are not cloudy all day. How often at night, when the heavens are bright with the light from the glittering stars, have I stood there amazed and asked as I gazed if their glory exceeds that of ours.